Good morning and welcome to the third edition of Children's Cancer Cause 2020 webinar series. My name is Julie Taylor, Director of Programs and Operations, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's edition is a mid-year advocacy update to provide a status report on a variety of legislative initiatives that could have an impact on children with cancer and survivors. We'll be taking a look at what needs to happen in the second half of 2020 to get legislation passed before the 116th Congress comes to a close. We're very fortunate to have with us experts in their field to help understand some campaigns and initiatives that are important to childhood cancer advocates. Before we hear from our experts, I'll go over some housekeeping items and then provide a brief overview of the Children's Cancer Cause mission and our key policy and programmatic priorities. So first to the housekeeping. If you need technical assistance during the webinar, you can either call 202-487-3270, or better yet, use the chat button that you see on the right-hand panel of your screen to reach us if you're having an issue. Today's call is being recorded and will be available on our website at childrenscancercause.org. During the course of the webinar, everybody will be on mute, but we encourage questions and hope you'll submit them. And you can do that through the questions box there on the right or the chat box. At the end of the webinar, you'll be automatically redirected to the post-webinar survey. And we really would appreciate it if you take a few minutes to complete the survey, as your input is very valuable to us. Next slide. Okay, Children's Cause mission is focused on the issues you see here listed on this slide, including research funding for NIH and other agencies, development of new treatments for pediatric cancer, advocacy for regulatory policies at FDA and other agencies, training advocates through our Kids Action Network, or CAN, and working with our advocates to address state coverage issues, and finally, supporting survivors. Next slide. Survivorship has always been a core focus of Children's Cause. One of the great challenges in the childhood cancer experience has been the transition of care, and Children's Cause is working on several initiatives to address this issue. One is to create a series of childhood cancer demonstration projects through the Medicaid program. This would test and refine many of the interventions being developed at the NCI under the STAR Act, and you'll hear a little bit more about that in the presentation. Next slide. We've also begun recognizing and encouraging expert development through a number of awards and programs. The first is the Rosen Award, which recognizes and encourages outstanding leadership in pediatric cancer advocacy and medical and survivorship research. Another is our College Scholars Program, and for the last 3 years, we've awarded these scholarships to childhood cancer survivors for their college studies. This year, we were fortunate enough to be able to expand our efforts to provide support to 7 survivors. And this year, we've also launched an annual Survivorship Champions Prize to recognize a group, program, or institution making significant advances in programs and services to provide lifelong health maintenance for survivors, specifically to recognize the importance of the unique challenges associated with post-treatment services for these survivors, especially as they transition to non-oncology adolescent and/or adult healthcare services. And we'll be announcing the very first recipient of the prize this fall. Next slide. The reasons we focus so intently on survivorship issues for our kids is because there are growing numbers of them, and they all face serious health risks, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. it's estimated there will be more than 500,000 childhood cancer survivors as of next year. Approximately 1 in 530 young adults between the ages of 20 and 39 is a survivor. More than 95% of childhood cancer survivors will have significant health-related issues by the time they're 45. And these health-related issues are side effects of either the cancer or more commonly the result of the treatment they received. 1/3 will suffer severe and chronic side effects, 1/3 will suffer moderate to severe health problems, and 1/3 will suffer slight to moderate side effects. So clearly we need to address the needs of these survivors. So now to our formal program. Again, we're pleased to have a slate of speakers to update us on important issues for the remainder of this congressional session. First, we have Sue Emmer from Emmer Consulting, and she is a policy consultant, our expert for Children's Cause. She has worked at the forefront of healthcare policy for over 30 years in both public and private sectors, and Sue will provide an overview of pediatric cancer policy during these very unusual times. Next, we'll hear from Ellyn Miller, who's founder and president of Smashing Walnuts, a childhood cancer foundation dedicated to raising awareness and funding for childhood brain cancer research. Ellyn will share an update on the Gabriella Miller's Kids First 2.0 to obtain a perpetual funding source for childhood cancer and disease research. Next will be Jonathan Miller, Senior Manager for Policy and Advocacy at the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, where he lobbies Congress on behalf of the more than 30,000 people with CF in the U.S. Jonathan will have an update on efforts to expand eligibility for paid family and medical leave in the age of COVID-19. And finally, we will have Janet Demeter of Jack's Angels. She's the organizer of the DIPG Advocacy group and host of Childhood Cancer Talk Radio. She'll provide a status report on the DIPG resolution to raise greater awareness for enhanced research for all pediatric cancers. So now I will turn it over to Sue Emmer.
Thank you, Julie. All right, I will go to my first slide, which is entitled Congressional Agenda 2020. And I'm going to come at this from a high level. I've probably included more material than time. And so I'm going to come at it broad brush and then leave the opportunity for folks to ask questions at the end. And I'm also, even though I know folks on the call probably have a wide array of backgrounds, I'm going to err on probably over including some basics on process, just so we're all level set at the same place. So I'm going to start off to talk about where we are right now in the legislative process. And we really have two big agenda items left for the end of the year before we get into the election silly season. And the first is the regular appropriations process, and that is funding for fiscal year 2021. Basically, we are watching and working on two different appropriations bills. The first one being the labor HHS bill, and that funds the NIH, National Institutes on Health, National Cancer Institute, that funds important work at the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, which I'll talk about a little later as well. And of course, every year we need to pass funding. And as I always say, the old days of schoolhouse rock are over, and we rarely pass bills on their own. So what we're looking at this year for both labor HHS, and I quickly skipped over DOD, but they also fund very important peer-reviewed pediatric cancer research. Instead of doing these bills on their own, the process now is that the House has passed a separate labor HHS bill and a separate Department of Defense bill. They're probably going to package those together into what we call a minibus. We could have action on that as early as the end of the week. So they're going to package 7 bills together, including the 2 I mentioned. And then the process moves to the Senate, which is a bit behind, and the conventional thinking here is the Senate is not going to act on their version of the appropriations process until they get through the COVID bill, which I'll get to in a moment. And so that won't happen until the earliest September, and it may not really happen in any major form. Last year, they didn't get through their full appropriations process before all the bills were put together into what we call a continuing resolution, which is a big package. And I think everyone agrees that is what will happen this year because it's an election year, so that the appropriations process will probably stay somewhat frozen where it is, and we'll have action, we'll have a short-term extension of funding, and then major action on all the appropriations bills at the end of the year, including items that we've talked about. So that's the status there. I'm going to talk, after I go over the status of COVID, I'll talk specifically on some of our issues. The other second major legislating item for the year is another COVID package. It has many names. In the House, it's called the next version, which would be the fourth version. There have been 3.5 versions up until now. Is the HEROES Act, which the House has passed. It's a very comprehensive bill, and they passed it, I don't know, 6 to 8 weeks ago. The Senate has done what they often do and put them in this bind where they're working right up against the deadline of when the unemployment benefit expires. And as you know, probably from reading the paper or watching the news, negotiations are very much happening now. A bill was released earlier this week, and that's the first salvo. That's the Senate Republican version, negotiated in some level with the administration. And I think now there's going to be back and forth, and I'm not going to guess about how that process goes because it's above my pay grade, and frankly, all of these processes have been very unusual for COVID, but it's to say that action is very much underway, and you know, at the earliest we'll have something before the August recess, or running into the August recess, which is supposed to end on the end of the first week of August, August 7th. But that could, negotiations on that could go into the recess, and that's typically something Congress does. So now to talk a little bit more specifically about the policy. Interestingly, on the appropriations, there are, even though there are appropriations issues in the COVID bill and in the appropriations bill, they're distinct from each other in some ways and connected in some. So I'll start with the fiscal year 2021 appropriations process. Basically, in terms of the House acting, NIH received $47 billion. This was an increase of 5.5. And the area that we really focus on, the STAR Act, also received $30 million. So just to take a moment to tell you about STAR, you've heard about it before. It's a major bill that passed maybe 3 years ago, dealing with survivorship and research and access. And we've been heavily engaged on the survivorship provisions and really all of the provisions. And at this point, now that this major comprehensive consensus legislation passed, there's sort of two big pieces we work on. And one is to make sure that every year it's adequately funded. So this year it was funded at the highest level that it could be. And then, and actually I said 30, but it's 50. And then the implementation as well of the bill, which we've been heavily engaged on as well, and specifically on some survivorship pieces. And I'll talk briefly about those, but STAR had, as Julie said, survivorship is sort of one of the hallmarks and areas we really focus in on at our organization. And there were about 5 different survivorship provisions of STAR. One of them putting in some a requirement for best practices research and understanding the state of pediatric survivorship, looking at disparities as well. And the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality has received funding to work on a 12 to 18 month process to do that, and we're engaged in that. Moving on to sort of the COVID package, COVID also has an appropriations component. And they have, one of the big things that the cancer community has been working on is clinical trials, and the fact that those have really, in some cases, been stopped, in other cases, been very much narrowed, where you have to be on site. And this is, of course, a major issue where in so many cases it's a standard of care for those with pediatric cancer. And so there's been work as a large community to get additional funding. The request was for 10 billion. And happy to say that the COVID bill does have on the Senate side 10 billion in funding for all sorts of COVID-related NIH research, and we think hopefully a major chunk of that would go to the clinical trials piece. I'm going to save the paid leave piece for the presenter that's going to talk about that and is heavily engaged for later as well. One or two other COVID items we're working on. There's something called the Clinical Treatment Act, which would require Medicaid. And actually, I think I hope I prompted you to move on to the next slide, the second slide, but I think you did. No, I'm sorry, back one. Sorry about that. Yeah, perfect. So Clinical Treatment Act is legislation that was introduced last Congress, and basically this would require Medicaid coverage for the routine costs of clinical trials. This is covered now under Medicare. It's covered as well under private plans, going back to the ACA. But Medicaid is the one area where there's not a federal standard, so it varies by state. Some states cover this, others don't. And we think this is really important legislation, especially in this time. And while this may not be considered as part of the COVID process, we hope it will. It may more likely be looked at under something called Cures 2.0, which is a separate process. And the last item I just want to raise a nugget on is this return to school piece for pediatric cancer patients. We haven't done a lot of granular work on how this might look, but we've started to talk amongst ourselves and with some in the community about the very unique sort of issue that comes up for those who are either under cancer treatment or in the survivorship phase or in that sort of post 5-year phase and returning to school, and whether that's something that we shouldn't be looking at more specifically from a policy perspective or practice perspective. So I don't have a lot to say about what we're doing, but would love to hear in question and answer if this is something you're dealing with and you know, kind of what your thoughts are, because we think going forward it's something we should focus on. So we're going to move to the next slide. I'm going to do this very quickly so we have time for others. Some of these are Julie nicely foreshadowed for me. These are the bread and butter issues we work on, the long-term policy focus issues for children's cause. And in terms of drug development, this is something we worked on a lot in something called PDUFA. And this is something which is a process Congress goes through every 5 years for prescription drug user fees. It's next up in 2020. And it's really, simply put, a vehicle for us to advance some non-user fee issues, typically having to do with the fact that there's, you know, not enough therapies, and for children with cancer, therapies tend to really lag beyond the adult. So we were able to get some really important language called RACE in PDUFA 6, and we're in our early stages of thinking what our agenda should be looking like going forward. Do we look at any changes, or because RACE is just being implemented, do we not know where we need to go? So we will be putting forward some policy recommendations in that area and working with our larger community. I already talked about STAR and survivorship a little, talked about the important, exciting work going on at ARC, ongoing work at NCI, and just a quick plug that we as an organization have been working hard on one piece that didn't get into STAR, and that is looking at testing demonstrations of how pediatric cancer survivorship might look, both as coverage and better access across the country, and having this offered up as legislation. We're also working on it administratively, engaged in early conversations with the Center for Medicare, Medicaid innovation, and then also with another agency within HHS that looks at technology. So those are really early conversations, but the bottom line is we feel like this is the last part of the survivorship continuum that wasn't included in the STAR Act, and it's something that we think is very, very important, and we're very much continuing to engage on. And COVID, unfortunately, has made it a little harder to work on this. Folks are really focused on some of the immediate issues going on now, but I just want to let you know it's something that we're still very much thinking about and engaged in, and in the future as well will be. So I think I'm going to stop there. I've thrown a lot at you, and I'm going to turn it over to the next speaker, who Julie introduced, but that's Ellyn Miller, who's going to talk about Kids First.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much to the Children's Cancer Cause for having me on to talk about this really great legislation. I actually have this one little slide right here, but what you'll see is you can click that there's a PDF, and we use a one-pager that we send to everybody in Congress and anybody else who wants to know the intimate details about this bill that we've got going on. So I'll cover all of this during my time that I have. And what I want to do first is give you a little bit of background and let you know that how I got to where I am. This was not my chosen path to go down this this congressional way of trying to get legislation passed for our children. My daughter, Gabriella, was 9 years old when she was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. Her tumor was the size of a walnut, and our family literally started smashing walnuts, signifying smashing her tumor. And we started our foundation just 3 months before she passed away. As a matter of fact, tomorrow is the anniversary of the day that we started the foundation. And what had happened was Gabriella was interviewed by a childhood cancer awareness organization at the time of sequestration. So government shut down because they couldn't balance the budget. Children that were going for treatments at NIH were being turned away. Gabriella had a chemotherapy that she needed the FDA to look at so she can continue with, and everything was shut down. And so the interviewer had asked Gabriella, if you could say anything to our elected officials, what would you say? And Gabriella was 10 years old, and she said, stop talking, start doing. And then she said, I don't care, I'm just gonna say it. Talk is bullshit, we need actions. And she burst into laughter. And the interviewer and I, you could hear us laughing hysterically off camera because how dare this 10-year-old little girl say a bad word? Well, less than a week after that interview, Gabriella came home on hospice, and she died a week after that. And the interviewer actually took snippets of that interview and put it out on social media, and it caught the attention of the former House Majority Leader, Eric Cantor. He had a bill that was languishing in the House, and he had asked if he could meet with me and my husband. So 2 weeks after Gabriella died, 1 month after that interview, we met with Eric Cantor in his office, and he asked if we would attach Gabriella's name to this bill. This original bill, the Gabriella Miller Kids First Research Act, proposed to move $126 million over to NIH to fund childhood cancer and childhood disease research. From the moment Gabriella's name was attached until we were in the Oval Office with former President Obama was just over 4 months, and it was signed into law. And from that moment in the Oval Office, it was just over 8 months before it was first appropriated. And as Sue had said earlier, that doesn't happen. The days of the Schoolhouse Rocks bill doesn't happen. So it's amazing the power of a little girl who had the words to call out our elected officials. So to date, I have gotten 6 consecutive years funded, over $75 million that has gone to NIH for funding childhood cancer and childhood disease research. And it is in the language for this next fiscal year as well. The issue with this bill is that it sunsets in just 4 years. And as we all know, we will not have cures for childhood cancer by that time. So I was searching for another funding source, and that's where the Kids First 2.0 comes into play. This bill is actually very, very exciting. It does not ask our elected officials to find the funds someplace. They don't need to appropriate it. It doesn't affect any of us taxpayers. It actually comes from an existing penalty against pharmaceuticals that break the law. So when they're caught, the fees are humongous. From 2013 to 2019, there were 6 penalties, over $500 million. Can you just imagine what we could do with $500 million to fund childhood cancer and childhood disease research? And so what you also need to know is that those monies, those penalties, currently go into the US General Treasury. They are not dedicated or earmarked. So our bill, the Gabriella Miller Kids First 2.0, HR 6556, when passed, will dedicate the funds in perpetuity for research for our children. So in the PDF that you could click on and link to, you will see that there are many links. One is to the original bill. Another link actually takes you to the NIH page, the Gabriella Miller page, but specifically to what has been funded. And please do take the time and click on all of these links, but especially that one, because you will see that there are institutions across the country that have received funding through the original Kids First, and they are doing some amazing research for our children. You will also see a link that will take you to our current bill. And I should share that this bill was introduced in mid-April, and it was, as we've got going on, the craziness with COVID. And I've actually had many people, both up on the Hill and just people within our childhood cancer and disease world, asking me why I pushed to have this bill introduced at this time. And the bottom line is that it does not matter what is going on in the world, in our country, in our state, in our family life. Disease waits for no one. And this bill, we need the funds for this. So we introduced this bill, and as of yesterday, we have 20 co-sponsors. So that is extremely exciting. And what we are asking is, we ask anybody who is listening, who wants to get involved, to please come join us. You will be able to get more information through Children's Cancer Cause. And it could be something as simple as on the Children's Cancer Cause website, there's a link that you can click on, and you would input your zip code, and it will tell you who your elected officials are. And you can send a letter to them saying, co-sponsor this bill. And if you'd like to go even further, you can certainly reach out to either the Children's Cancer Cause or directly to Smashing Walnuts Foundation, because we are having Zoom meetings with our elected officials where we are telling them about this bill, and more specifically, spending time where we're asking the advocates to talk about their childhood cancer or childhood disease story, and say that we need the funding, and you as our elected official, we want you to co-sponsor and sign on to this bill. I should also share with you that we do have a Senate champion. They have not introduced in the Senate yet because we are working on the language. It's going through Ledge Council right now, but that is forthcoming. And we're thrilled with how this bill has been moving forward. I actually will turn this now over to Jonathan Daniels with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. And if you've got questions during the Q&A, please reach out to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellyn. That was really inspiring to hear all the great work you and folks, children's cancer advocates all over the country are doing to make a difference in the lives people with pediatric cancer. So thanks again. I am Jonathan Daniels. I'm Senior Manager for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. I'm grateful to be here today, so thank you to Children's Cause Cancer Advocacy for having me here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the efforts that CFF is leading to expand paid leave for vulnerable populations at high risk of complications for COVID-19 and their working household members during the pandemic. So next slide.
Jonathan?
Yes.
This is Julie. I don't know whether you put yourself on speaker or not, but we're having a hard time. The quality of the sound is not very good.
Okay. Okay. Give me just a second. I'm going to go grab some headphones. So why don't you skip to the next speaker and then I'll come back.
Well, we'll give you a second.
Okay.
Our apologies, everyone.
Julie, there was a question that came in for Ellyn, if you wanted to maybe address that while we're waiting for Jonathan.
Yes, that's a great idea. So we have a question for Ellyn from Jill Moran, who asked, how did you find that pool of money?
Oh, hello. Okay, so thank you for asking that question, Jill. Interesting story. We initially, for the 2.0, had a different funding source. Long story with that. We no longer are working with that funding source. And what I had done was I had reached out to my current congresswoman, asking her to help me, and she suggested a funding source. And basically what she had done was, here's an idea. I want you to do all the research and tell me whether or not this is a viable funding source. So I work with some attorneys that are up on Capitol Hill, extensive reports and research that we did, and came back to my congresswoman. She had trepidations, wondering if the opposite side of the aisle would sign on. And I said, no worries, I'll get all the co-sponsors. So I, especially in this crazy political climate that we're in, wanted to ensure that this bill would be 100% bipartisan. So I went out and I made sure that we had 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans for this bill out the door. So it was a lot of research on my part, a lot of fighting to make sure that we got what we wanted. And just having an elected official that was willing to make a suggestion, because as we all know, funding sources do not grow on the tree. So happy to have that one. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. Jonathan, are you back? Should we move on to Janet? We apologize. We want to make sure you can hear what Jonathan has to say. Okay, so we're going to move on to Janet, who's going to talk about her resolution. Janet?
Hey, good morning or almost afternoon on the East Coast. My name is Janet Demeter. I'm coming to you from California this morning, and I just, number one, can't thank the Children's Cancer Cause enough for the tireless work that you do for all of us and supporting each of us in our different endeavors here on different sides of the advocacy experience. I just thank you, Ellyn, for your share. It was, it's because of what you do that I'm inspired to do this. The DIPG Awareness Resolution is, it's a people's bill. It's not actually authorizing legislation. It raises awareness to the urgent unmet needs of children. with cancer and deadly disease in our society. I'll just read to you briefly. Despite its consistent death toll as the leading cancer-related cause of childhood mortality in the United States, pediatric brain cancer, of which DIPG, diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, is the second most common type and the deadliest, it's seen no significant change in its standard treatment protocol or its prognosis, terminal prognosis, since Neil Armstrong's daughter Karen died of it in 1962. This is why we use the hashtag Moonshot for Kids. DIPG exemplifies in a powerful way the challenges in treating pediatric cancer and the daily tragedies which ensue from the general lack of solutions our medical research industry has for deadly pediatric disease. The DIPG Awareness Resolution HRES 114 is a simple House resolution requiring only a House vote. It is not a law. It is apolitical with no funds allocated. It does, however, suggest that for any given cancer type, years of life lost associated with it, meaning pediatrics, as well as the mortality rate, be given more consideration in the research grant process. This awareness resolution has an awareness day attached to it, May 17th, in the middle of Brain Tumor Awareness Month for pediatric brain cancer. In the 1990s, there was a ban on any resolution with a commemorative period of time attached to it that recognized or honored individuals or organizations. That was the original language in the ban. There have been very rare exceptions made, and we are writing a letter to House leadership. Our advocacy group has written a couple, but there will be a letter circulating making the case, because we have to, unfortunately, that our children with cancer and deadly rare disease deserve attention, because for decades they've been falling through the cracks of our medical research system, which sadly does not prioritize our children or those facing certain or probable death. As we all know, they go by numbers, investments, returns, and the practical economy of life, which of course is important, but our children are getting lost through the cracks. This raising awareness to this issue is also meant to bolster and support those of our advocates who are working tirelessly at Children's Cancer Cause, advocates like Ellyn Miller with the Gabriella Miller Kids First Research Act 2.0, and Nancy Goodman right now is testifying in a hearing to make the case for the Creating Hope Reauthorization Act of 2019. These things should be no-brainers, but they're not. We have to fight so hard for them. As someone had just alluded to, there was a piece of the STAR Act that, you know, we have to fight for everything to be included and for the allocations to happen. This just shouldn't be. But people and Congress are not aware of the urgency of the need of these kids, and DIPG exemplifies that in a powerful way. And this was first introduced in 2016. It's been introduced 3 times. It's in its 5th year of advocacy, and we're finally confronting this issue now with 130 co-sponsors plus, with more to show up. We're having, just so you know, we're having also having Zoom meetings through the summer to ask our members of Congress to support it. And honestly, each member that we get to meet with directly signs on. They are unaware that cancer is the #1 cause of death by disease for children in our country. They're unaware that brain cancer is one of the most prevalent forms of childhood cancer. It edges out leukemia slightly in incidence, and it's also responsible for the most death. And Congress doesn't really know this. The public isn't really aware of this urgent unmet need. And so DIPG is not made here to be more important than other diseases, but rather it exemplifies in a very powerful way this larger need for our children, period, in our country. What more can I tell you is that we're going to have this letter from our advocacy group to House leadership making the case. We're inviting people to sign on it. We're inviting people, if they want, to join in on meetings to help raise awareness for the urgent needs of our children with cancer. But specifically, DIPG is like a death row for kids, and most people don't know that. And so by the end of the session of Congress, another 2,000 children will have died of DIPG alone. And that's not, of course, including other brain cancers and other childhood cancers as a whole. They're all marginalized as rare and receive inadequate research attention and funding, as you all know. I'm preaching to the choir here. And also for other deadly diseases that aren't as prevalent as cancers, but they're all, of course, marginalized as rare and don't get the attention that they need. And so we're hoping that this will be the year. Finally, we have a shot. We have, again, over a quarter of the House signed on. Again, every time we speak with an actual member and let them know about this, they're like, oh, of course. And we're hoping that if this does pass, that it'll make all of our advocacy efforts easier. Again, our children, sadly, as you all know, are not prioritized in our medical research system or the investment culture. And that's what we're trying to shine a light on. The resolution has provided a platform for raising awareness. We had a briefing in February, which was, of course, overshadowed by COVID and the Russia investigation probe, which was the same day, a hearing on that. But we were going to continue bringing this message to Congress, whether or not we get the bill passed. We're going to have, again, this letter, also a letter from members of Congress to House leadership who support the bill. And this will culminate in a rally we're organizing, of course, with social distancing. We don't expect a large turnout, but it will be at the United States Capitol on September 25th, Friday, September 25th. It was originally scheduled to happen right after the Childhood Cancer Caucus Summit, which of course is going to be virtual this year, but that's the time that we'll be having it from 12 to 3 p.m. We'll have virtual live streaming and of course also virtual participation. We're going to invite lead advocates of all the important measures and initiatives right now for childhood cancer to participate and to share and to rally around their bill to get more support. And so we're looking forward to at least having one live event at the United States Capitol for you in September with this, again, all inclusive. This is to support all these measures and hopefully get our little bill that could, the Moonshot for Kids, over the finish line this year. It's a people's bill. It's for us. And I really appreciate your attention and support. For more information, you can visit dipgadvocacy.org. There's ample information about advocating for this. Also links to the Google form to sign on will be available by Friday. And I will update Children's Cancer Cause with what we're doing with that. So thank you so much for allowing me the time to share with you. DIPG also represents the voiceless. Most all of our children die. Most all of our families are too devastated to even think of hopeful advocacy. So with this bill, we are trying to give a voice to those who can't speak. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Janet. I think we have our audio problem solved, so we're going to turn it back to Jonathan Daniels.
Thank you very much. Hopefully we have solved the audio problems. It would not be a webinar. Great. I'm glad to hear that. It would not be a webinar if there wasn't a technical difficulty, although it is, of course, massively mortifying when it involves yourself. So anyway, we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. We're here to talk a little bit about the expanded paid leave policy that CFF is pursuing in concert with groups like Children's Cause. We will start off at the beginning with, the beginning of the pandemic in March required significant congressional response. And I know Sue mentioned some of those at the outset of this program. Why expanded leave? So let's look at what Congress did during March to try to allow families with vulnerable members the opportunity to stay home and self-isolate during the outset of the pandemic. In the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, Congress expanded paid leave in two ways. They provided 2 weeks of expanded sick leave, and they provided 10 weeks of expanded family and medical leave. Many of you will likely be familiar with family medical leave because that's a policy that already exists at the federal level, but it is unpaid and it is 12 weeks. Congress changed that policy, or it expanded it for certain populations. However, there were gaps in these policies. Next slide. And so those gaps were fairly significant. For the expanded sick leave, that was only for 2 weeks. These bills were enacted and essentially began at the very beginning of April. So 2 weeks of sick leave, of expanded sick leave, assuming that you had not used any of your other sick leave, if you had access to that, may be significant. But if you'd already used some sick leave or had only accrued a few days, maybe a week of sick leave, you would only be afforded the 80 hours, which would get you through mid-April. There were 6 criteria for expanded sick leave, and self-isolation was one of those criteria. So, for example, if your family member has a pediatric form of cancer and lives at home, you, as an employee of a company, should have been eligible to self-isolate due to the loved one having pediatric cancer for 2 weeks. However, that's only 2 weeks. That's where expanded FMLA kicked in. However, expanded FMLA was only available to those with child care needs, and those were centered around essentially 2 pandemic-specific functions. Number one, your child's school closed due to the pandemic, which happened throughout the country. Or number 2, your daycare provider closed due to the pandemic. And in many cases, as I think we all know, some daycare providers are still closed due to the pandemic. But those weren't the only exemptions. So even if you met one of those 2 criteria for expanded FMLA, you would have had to have worked for an employer under 500 people, because employers over 500 people were exempt. You would have had to have worked for an organization that wasn't exempt through various small business exemptions that the Department of Labor had pretty broad statutory authority to provide. And you would have had to have been considered a non-essential employee. And as we know, a lot of employees through the pandemic were considered essential. And that gets, not just in frontline healthcare workers, but also people like grocery store clerks, et cetera. So there were massive gaps in this policy, and CFF started getting calls straight away from our community asking what could be done. So next slide. So this gets at why the CF Foundation began advocating on this issue. We got calls from people throughout the country saying, hey, my child has cystic fibrosis, or I have cystic fibrosis. My spouse has cystic fibrosis, and we're worried about going to work, contracting COVID-19, and bringing it home to a family member, or me myself as somebody with CF, or I've had to self-isolate from my family for 2 months. This is not sustainable. What can I do? So the CF Foundation decided to look at some policies that would benefit vulnerable populations like those with CF, also those with pediatric cancer, but more importantly, caregivers of those with pediatric cancer. So what we want to see in the next COVID-19 package is expanded paid leave for vulnerable populations, and really importantly, working aged household members. We want the arbitrary 10-week FMLA time limit to be eliminated to get us through the duration of the pandemic. And we want to make sure that this expanded paid leave applies to employers of all sizes and doesn't discriminate against essential workers. That way, people who need paid leave can access it, because, an important element of paid leave isn't just the ability to have an income. It's also to keep your health insurance. When you lose your job, you often lose your health insurance, or you're told to go on COBRA, which is very expensive in most cases. So that's a really important consideration. Next slide. So this is what we've done to date, and we're really grateful for Children's Cause for Cancer in joining our sign-on letter and sending out action alerts around this issue to the cancer community. The support of the cancer community is so critical. You're so powerful on Capitol Hill. I know that Ellyn actually just spoke a little bit ago about the power of the child advocate, and the other colleague Janet spoke about it too. So having the cancer community behind us is absolutely critical. So the first step was we organized a 162 organization sign-on letter that we sent up to the Hill in early April. At the time, we thought there would be a new coronavirus package maybe by mid to late April, maybe May. Here we are in almost August, and nothing has happened yet. So advocacy continues. CFF sent an action alert to Capitol Hill. We also shared a template action alert at the time to the stakeholder community that signed the letter so that they could join in on that. We also identified CF community stories and connected those stories to their members of Congress. So at this point in time, we've held 18 targeted constituent Senate meetings with whether it's members of the CF community that were impacted, doctors who work at care centers who can talk about this issue. We also had the cancer community represented in a meeting with Senator Joni Ernst in Iowa. Cancer support communities joined us and were, such great advocates for why this is important, not just for people who are vulnerable to COVID-19, but again, caregivers. Anybody who has that person at home that might be considered vulnerable to COVID-19, the ability to take paid time off is so critical. We've also placed personal interest stories in the media. We've had, fairly significant pickup actually of the types of stories where, maybe it's a CF community member in Nashville who unfortunately had to quit her job because she felt unsafe going to work. The pandemic does not seem to be going away, and her employer could not continue justifying her working at the organization. So she unfortunately had to quit her job. There is a CF mom in Arizona who's been in a number of pieces, whether it's the Arizona Republic or most recently in a Huffington Post story on expanding unemployment insurance and paid leave, who is the mother of 2 children with CF. And she's extremely worried about what is going back to school look like. She's had to keep her job because she needs to keep her paycheck, but she's worried about her children. We've also had local news stations take up this story, whether it's in Michigan, also in Nashville, Tennessee, trying to explain to people that this isn't people who don't want to work. These are folks who love the jobs they have, who need the jobs they have, but who unfortunately have underlying health conditions which make them particularly vulnerable to COVID-19, and they have to be able to have some recourse from the pandemic, and unfortunately just don't now. And more, we've worked with a bunch of other stakeholder organizations to make our voices heard on Capitol Hill. Next slide, please. So this is where we stand. I know that Sue mentioned earlier the HEROES Act that the House passed in late May. We were really grateful to House Democrats for including our expanded paid leave request in that bill. And they pretty much did everything that we asked for, with the exception of they continued to keep the 10-week time limit on the expanded FMLA, but vastly broadened the eligibility of who could actually get the FMLA to include populations like ours, populations like yours. So we were grateful to see them do that. But we know that the hard part is what happens in the negotiations. So we know that the Senate GOP, for example, in the bill that they released on Monday evening, did not include expanded paid leave. We were not surprised by this. We knew that the Senate GOP was likely to have a very small bill. Comparatively speaking, it's around $1 trillion. There was a number of things that the House did that the Senate didn't do, so that they could possibly compromise and give a little bit to get a little bit. And negotiations continue, which means that we continue to push this issue, particularly to Senate GOP members, to help them understand that this is something that directly impacts their communities. The person in Missouri whose wife works at a nursing home, he himself has CF, had a sibling die from CF when he was, a teenager. She has to quit her job at the nursing home because of the COVID-19 outbreak, and she's worried about bringing it home. What happens to them? These are stories that really resonate on the Hill. As you know, as pediatric cancer advocates, they have a hard time, not being extremely empathetic to what happens in your lives. And that's the same with expanded paid leave. So negotiations continue. Like I said, we're extremely grateful for the cancer community's involvement in our expanded paid leave advocacy, and I would be happy to take any questions at the end of this webinar. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. That concludes our formal presentation, and we'd like to open the discussion up to the audience for questions. I know we answered one question during our technical difficulty moment, but as a reminder, if you have a question, you can use the question box there on the right or the chat box. And we do have one question from Susan Weiner. She asked, regarding school entry, is there attention being paid to the fact that childhood cancer patients can be immune compromised if in treatment or shortly out of treatment, especially since many treatments go on for extended periods of time?
Well, I'll address that again from a super high level, since I'm the one. This is Sue Emmer, and I'm the one who introduced it into the discussion. I think the question for us on the policy side is, is this a federal issue? Obviously, most of all the school policies on the ground have been decided locally. So the federal has been, more funding. But we do think it's an important issue that we need to dig into for the very reason that Susan suggests in terms of being immunocompromised. And I think you should expect to hear more from us on this. And it's good to hear that it sounds like you think this is an issue.
Thank you, Sue. Do we have any other questions? Well, hearing no more live questions, you can also submit questions to us via email by writing us at info@childrenscause.org. So with that, since there are no more questions, I just want to again thank Sue, Ellyn, Jonathan, and Janet for contributing their time and sharing their expertise with us. And we thank all of you for your participation and your continued interest and support for our collective mission, which is curing childhood cancer and ensuring that survivors have long, healthy lives. As a reminder, please take a minute to complete our post-webinar survey, which will pop up. You'll be automatically directed to this. We really appreciate your feedback, and it helps us improve these webinars as we move forward. If you'd like more information, please visit us at the Children's Cause website, childrenscancercause.org. There will be a recording of the webinar along with all the handouts and links that were covered in today's presentation, along with the PowerPoint. So we make sure we want to have that available for you. And as a reminder, we conduct these webinars on a regular basis, and we like to cover topics and speakers that help inform and energize you as you do your advocacy. So we hope you'll join us again. And until then, thank you. Enjoy the remainder of your summer. Bye for now.